Hello, my name is John Diamond-Nigh. I'm a writer and an artist and a teacher. I live in Asheville, North Carolina with my wonderful wife and three wonderful, very difficult cats. I have written a book of poems called Twine that I would like to introduce you to. Um, if you have any interest in looking at it yourself, it's available on Amazon or through Kelsey Books, the publisher in California. Before I talk about the book, I would like to talk a little bit about what I think the role of poetry is. If you imagine culture or our consumption of culture as a shopping cart that's full of bags of Tostito chips and bottles of Coke and half gallons of ice cream, that's fine to a point. But come around the corner with me to the produce section where there are oranges and apples and cherries and cashews, things that are delicious, things that are nutritious, things that are colorful. That's how I think of poetry. I think that we forget that the human spirit needs as much nutritional attention as our body does. And a good book, a good song, a good movie gives us those essential nutrients. People are curious about how things are made. How is a book of poetry made? How is a chair made? How is a cornflake made? So I'll take a little bit of time to describe the process for me. It's not a universal formula. I don't think there is one for writing poetry. In my case, I get up in the morning, I make a cup of coffee, have coffee with my wife, feed the cats, I may take a short walk. And then I sit down at my computer and transcribe what I think of as a gift of the night, something that has percolated through my sleep. And whether it's good or bad, I put it down on my computer. And over time, I accumulate this long, skinny continent of text without going back and reflecting on it for a long time. The more time that can go by, the better, to the point where I forget about what I've written. And then I will go back months later, if I have the luxury of waiting that long, and read it and wait to be surprised, for a particular image to surprise me or a particular line to surprise me. And that I'll underline or highlight, and that's where I will begin a poem. And what is always curious to me is that those images and those lines are usually ones that I didn't even notice the first time around. And the images and lines that I thought were important end up on the cutting room floor, along with probably 80 or 90% of what I have written. What I try to do in the end is make a good poem, but also retain the greenness of that gift, the mystique of that unconscious revelation. So I try not to overwork it to the point where those qualities have become sterilized. What is Twine about? Twine is, in kind of a nutshell, a country mouse, city mouse parable. The country mouse is an examination of my own childhood and my own youth, growing up in a religious fundamentalist environment and the ways in which that tore me apart. There was a quality of terror, of emotional coercion that that was very injurious, and that I would eventually have to grow out of and leave. So some of the poems are very severe about fundamentalist or evangelical religion. At the same time, it's a retrospective nostalgia into a world that also had a wonderful sweetness about it. It was a rural world. Most of my uncles were farmers, so I spent a lot of time on their farms. And the book wrestles with that duality of the difficulty, even the trauma of a particular vein of Christianity in our culture, with the corresponding or the parallel loveliness of a quiet rural upbringing. Just one image, a dirty old light bulb hanging in an isolated barn, late at night, standing there with my father, under this light bulb bagging seeds, and this strange rapport that arose between us in that almost surreal kind of context. And then the magical way that his powerful wrist would tie off the top of the bag with a short length of twine, which is one of the origins of the title of the book of poems. So there's this countryside, country mouse side, in which I kind of wrestle with these two alternating aspects, the beauty and the difficulty, the trauma. The city side is an appreciation of cities as I came into adulthood and discovered art and just discovered the compressive energy and dynamism of cities, and the way that cosmopolitan culture in many ways saved me, redeemed me from the earlier difficulties that I had. Particularly, for many years, my wife and I taught in Paris, Barcelona, and Florence. And I came to love those cities with a real intensity, particularly Paris. So much so, there was a familiarity with Paris that I couldn't account for, except to imagine, either metaphorically or sometimes even literally, that I had been there before, I had lived there before. And so this excursion into nostalgia that goes back into childhood with the country mouse side of the book actually goes much deeper into time, with this notion that in Paris in particular, I may have lived there, I may have been there a long, long time ago. I'm not a particularly mystical person, so this notion was, there was a foreignness to this notion to begin with, and that in itself intrigued me as a point of departure, as a point of thinking about how my life has evolved. So that's a little overview of poetry, of the creative process for me, and of what Twine itself is about. It's a deeply personal book. I'll conclude by reading a short poem. Since I was speaking of Paris, I'll read a poem called Rue de Montparnasse. Each one of us must die as soon as any god imagines us. Who knows if that is true? It was an aphorism written on a napkin in a small cafe on Rue de Montparnasse That day a man was on the terrace, making tranquil annotations in a paperback. Retired civil servant by the look of him, his suit a little worn. The pen, by contrast, quite an opulent, pearlescent beauty. Edging close, I watched him fill the margins of his Bertrand Russell paperback with grocery lists and musings on existence. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching.